Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Hope you're all doing well. Welcome to the seminar, Shrinking Space, How Disinformation Campaigns Affect Muslim Humanitarian Organizations. My name is Akram Yasin Abdurrahman, and I have the privilege and honor to be moderating this seminar. Today, we're here to discuss the new research from George Mason University, which highlights how Muslim humanitarian organizations in the West are being heavily targeted by coordinated disinformation campaigns. These highly skewed and false narratives, driven often by political actors, think tanks, and often media networks, have led to frozen bank accounts, legal scrutiny, and threats to staff safety. To present this new and highly important research, we have the honor to be joined by Dr. Gerald FitzGerald, who will begin with a 40-minute overview of the report. Dr. FitzGerald is an affiliated faculty member at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. His commentary on issues related to cultural diplomacy, politics, and religion has been carried out by Associated Press Religion News Service and The Conversation, among many other stakeholders. Following the presentation, we will move into a panel discussion on how disinformation is a threat to the Muslim civil society and what can be done to protect the democratic space. So with that being said, I would like to bring Professor FitzGerald up to the stage to commence with the presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. My name is Gerald FitzGerald. I'm a political scientist and affiliated faculty at George Mason University. Today I'll be sharing some findings from a report that I produced along with a small team last year. And the report examines how anti-Muslim discrimination intersects with disinformation, particularly in the humanitarian space. So specifically how US Muslim-led humanitarian relief and international development organizations are targeted by disinformation attacks and what that means for human rights, civic space, and policy. So, over the past decade, humanitarian organizations of every kind have faced escalating reputational and political attacks, from the White Helmets for their work in Syria, to the International Committee for the Red Cross for their work in Ukraine and domestically in the US and elsewhere, to Médecins Sans Frontières and Save the Children, particularly for their relief operations in the Mediterranean Sea, providing aid to migrants, as well as the US-based evangelical charity World Vision for their work in Gaza. Understanding who is driving these campaigns and how they work is essential if we want to shore up the humanitarian sector, as these attacks shape political debate, reshape funding environments, and erode public trust. Since the release of our project report in 2024, the humanitarian sector in the US has been decimated, and escalating attacks on humanitarian NGOs and even government agencies, such as USAID, by actors with narrow political agendas have played a significant role in that. So, our assessment is that there are several structural reasons for this undue pressure on the humanitarian sector. First, humanitarian NGOs act as information conduits, documenting civilian harm, producing evidence, sharing information that may disrupt conflict narratives favored by powerful political actors. As civil society organizations become more visible in these spaces, they become targets. Second, humanitarian groups often work in conflict zones where they routinely share geographic space with non-state actors whose affiliations on the ground may be unclear. In other words, as a humanitarian actor entering into a fragile political environment or a conflict zone, it's really quite difficult to determine whether individuals or groups that you're interacting with are not designated, right? Finally, a factor that is turbocharging these attacks in recent years is the resurgence of new forms of nationalism, particularly forms of nationalism with ethnic, nativist, supremacist, and or religiously exclusivist dimensions. So I'm thinking here specifically of Christian nationalism in the US, elements of the current coalition government in Israel, Hindu nationalism in India, etc., etc. So Muslim-led humanitarian NGOs face an additional layer of vulnerability over and above those faced by other faith-based or secular humanitarian relief NGOs. There are a number of reasons for this. One is that they operate in environments under persistent anti-Muslim stereotypes and tropes. And this has been especially true over the last quarter century, when customary acts of Muslim charity have become sort of pathologized in a post-September 11th environment. Also, Muslim-led humanitarian INGOs are highly visible. They are, legally transparent, often associated sometimes deliberately, sometimes through innuendo with risk. And because many are growing and professionalizing rapidly, these reputational threats can be especially destabilizing. So in this project, we had a number of interrelated research questions. So I'll just outline them for you here, and then I'll move into methodology and techniques, and then give you some concrete examples, right? So the sort of overarching research question we had is, what individuals and groups are manipulating information about Muslims, particularly about US-based Muslim-led humanitarian relief and development aid NGOs? What sorts of arguments do they employ? How do these arguments make their way to policymakers and financial institutions? What stakeholders are amplifying this disinformation? And what stakeholders are making decisions based on this disinformation? How does that impact US-based Muslim-led INGOs? So as we set about answering that set of questions, we did a whole bunch of desk research. We identified the 9 largest US-based Muslim-led humanitarian relief organizations, and we ordered them by their size in terms of revenue. I have Islamic Relief and Helping Hand for Relief and Development up there, because they were in the number 1 and number 2 spots, respectively. So then, once we'd identified that list, we did a series of structured web searches for each of the 9 humanitarian organizations, using search strings such as the name of the organization and extremism and terrorism or terrorist, etc., etc. And we took the 300 or so results from these searches and distinguished between what were reputational attacks on the humanitarian organizations and benign results. So the benign results might be things like one of the humanitarian organizations issuing a refutation of an attack, right? Saying, we're not an extremist organization, blah, blah, blah. That would show up in our searches. We discard that, and we just focused in on the reputational attacks and assessed the reputational attacks, assessed the claims made in the attacks, and then traced the attacks back to where we could find where they were originally created, right? So in the process of doing that kind of process tracing method, we devised a 3-part typology of actors involved in the attacks. So these are the generators, the disseminators, and the legitimators. So generators create original narratives. They're the ones who sort of come up with the narrative or the attack. They're usually activist think tanks with narrow ideological or political objectives, usually in support of state actors in armed conflicts. They create the original weaponized narratives. Disseminators are media outlets, activist groups, government-organized NGOs who are ideologically supportive, are sympathetic to the aims of the generators, and work to amplify their narratives. Legitimators are often individuals associated with activist think tanks or NGOs who give these claims undue credibility by circulating them across policy spaces or, including, in the US on Capitol Hill in Congress, right? As well as across various agencies of the executive branch. Right, so just to give you a couple of examples of that, they may testify at hearings in Congress where some of them are like well known on Capitol Hill. They're kind of go-to people to bring in to testify on certain topics, although their expertise is sometimes questionable, or almost always questionable. They may do things like organize events at think tanks in the Washington, D.C. area where they will bring in generators of disinformation, or people that we identify as generators, and put them together with politicians, and so introduce the narratives into political space. So in doing this entire exercise, we identified 5 US-based organizations responsible for the most attacks. So here are the 5: the Middle East Forum, Investigative Project on Terrorism, Center for Security Policy, the Gatestone Institute, and a smaller organization based in Boston called Americans for Peace and Tolerance. So it's worth saying that all these organizations are somewhat connected to one another. People within the organizations often co-author articles and content with one another. They post each other's content on each other's sites, and of course this acts to increase search engine optimization and to raise their disinformation narratives up in things like Google searches. Also, worth noting that they all operate in the US under what is known as 501c3 status, which refers to the US tax code that provides them as nonprofit organizations with tax advantages. They can, for example, they have eligibility to receive tax-free donations. All of these activities that they're engaged in are, of course, protected by the First Amendment, which in the US affords, considerable free speech rights, right? And the ability to hold them accountable legally for defamation is restricted, right? It's very difficult to actually sue these organizations for defamation, right? So the work of these 5 organizations basically constitutes the backbone of a disinformation ecosystem. More recently, I would say that the landscape has changed a little bit. Social media, individual social media influencers such as Laura Loomer, Amy Meck, and others are now sort of feeding these kinds of narratives directly into the Trump administration. So I think that the kind of ecosystem has shifted a little bit in that sense. So I just wanted to note that. So what the generators do in their narratives is they basically collapse Islamic aid cultures into political activity. They promote the false idea that Muslim-led NGOs are inherently ideological, that customary acts of Muslim charity are inherently suspicious, and that aid work is a political threat. They cast Muslim-led organizations as Islamist, or as fronts for the Muslim Brotherhood, playing on ignorance, negating the fact that Muslim humanitarian organizations prioritize universalist and professionalized identities over Islamic identities in the main part. So this, this collapse of Islamic aid cultures into political activity erases these organizations' organizational diversity and obscures the real humanitarian work that they are carrying out in some of the most fragile geographies in the world. So I want to talk a little bit about the tactics the generators use, and then I'll present 3 concrete examples just to show you exactly how this works. So some of the tactics they use are things like shotgun argumentation. So this involves sort of rapidly and haphazardly presenting numerous arguments or points, frequently without adequately supporting or explaining them. And I'll show you an example or something that kind of approximates that. Another tactic that they use is circular reporting, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, but they routinely cite their own prior disinformation. So they'll cite their own articles that they've written before, they'll cite each other's articles, they'll co-author with each other, and what this does and then of course they'll disseminate it through media organizations, often transnationally. And what this does is sort of create a kind of swirl of disinformation that appears to corroborate itself, right? So by virtue of appearing to corroborate itself, it seems to kind of verify the information, right? So online tools such as Wikipedia are often then edited to reflect the disinformation that is produced within this ecosystem. Something that we see very commonly in these narratives is guilt by association. This involves spuriously connecting an organization to a demonized group of people or a bad person to discredit it. Connections are often insignificant, involving individuals happening to be in the same place at the same time, or even individuals being in the same place at different times, right? Just the fact that they've been in the same place at some time or other is used as a connection, right? They may also include tying organizations or individuals together with several degrees of separation, right? 3, 4 degrees of separation. Also, selective editing is quite common in this environment, or misuse of primary sources. So the disinformation actors will look at a primary source and they will kind of think, how can I present information here in the worst possible light, right? So there might be a primary source that's open to multiple different interpretations, and they will automatically pick an interpretation that one mightn't even think of that's just the worst possible interpretation, right? So, these are all sort of classic tools of manipulated information. They're designed to kind of play into fears, play into tropes, to create, high arousal, emotional responses, etc. in the consumer. So I'm just going to present 3 examples that I think are sort of particularly good examples. The first one is cherry picking. I'm not cherry picking these examples. You can look at the report and read the report. There's a whole series of examples in the report. But cherry picking in this sense involves selecting data that appear to confirm a position while ignoring contradictory data. So let me read this paragraph up here. Before founding the Zakat Foundation in 2001, its director worked for the Benevolence International Foundation. The U.S. Treasury Department designated BIF and related entities as terror financiers in 2002. The Illinois-based BIF and its CEO were charged the same year with misusing charitable contributions to support al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups overseas. Right? So that sounds really bad, right? Until you actually scratch the surface and dig into the claims that are made in that paragraph, right? So let's analyze the claims, right? Suspicion is cast on the current director of the Zakat Foundation of America, premised on the fact, apparently, that the individual in question formerly worked for a charity, BIF, that was designated by the US Treasury Department in the immediate aftermath of the September 11th attacks. The charity in question and the CEO were charged with supporting al-Qaeda, among other things. So that's the claims that are being made. But here are the facts of the case, right? The US Department of Justice dropped its case against the Benevolence International Foundation in 2002. A US District Court judge found no evidence that the CEO identified with or supported terrorism. So the entire case being made against the director of Zakat Foundation in this paragraph completely falls apart if there's no connection between BIF and terrorism, right? Because it's entirely premised on there being that connection, right? However, this narrative continues to circulate. It was offered in sworn testimony to Congress by someone we identify in the report as a legitimator. And there are several examples in the report of narratives exactly like this, and definitely more than one in the report of legitimators who appeared in front of Congress, offered this sort of sworn testimony to Congress, which ended up being just what we would call in the US a nothing burger, right? Here's one that relates specifically to Islamic relief, and it was again offered by somebody as sworn testimony in front of Congress. So Bangladesh, a Muslim country, does not allow Islamic relief to do humanitarian work with Rohingya refugees because they're worried about radicalization. So this claim is demonstrably false. Islamic relief has an office in Bangladesh, has had a presence in Bangladesh since, I believe, the early 1990s. Here's a picture of Rohingya refugee children holding education kits provided by Islamic relief. But this narrative plays on the fact that there was a very brief period of time during the massive influx of Rohingya refugees into the Cox's Bazar region of Bangladesh, where Islamic relief, along with several other aid agencies, were temporarily denied entry into Cox's Bazar as the Bangladeshi government was sort of in a panic and trying to figure out what to do. But the Bangladeshi government never made any specific allegations against Islamic relief. So again, this is a demonstrably false statement, right? So here's an example of guilt by association. Again, it involves spuriously connecting a target organization to demonize group of people or a bad person, right? Under the Biden administration, the most alarming grant is $50,000 from USA to HHRD, one of the most dangerous Islamist charities in the United States. In 2017, HHRD openly partnered with the designated Pakistani terror group Lashkar-e-Taiba, which carried out the deadly 2008 Mumbai attacks in which 166 were murdered, right? So there's a sort of shotgun argumentation going on there. There's a lot in there, right? So basically the generator narrative here is linking the Biden administration through USAID to HHRD to Lashkar-e-Taiba, right? We investigated this claim and determined we really dug deep into this one and determined that HHRD never openly partnered with Lashkar-e-Taiba. This is false. So again, the entire narrative is dependent upon this false link between HHRD and Lashkar-e-Taiba. If that link doesn't exist, then the entire narrative is completely meaningless, right? You'll notice that both the Biden administration and USAID are smeared in the process. This is something that's quite common to these narratives. Once they create, some false link, for example, between HHRD and Lashkar-e-Taiba, they will use it multiple times to smear different political actors that they have some problem with for whatever reason. And in this particular case, it was the Biden administration. I've also seen cases where local Republican politicians in Michigan are drawn into these kind of smear campaigns. It really becomes a sort of free-for-all. So again, this is a guilt by association narrative. I would say, in a healthy civic ecosystem, this kind of broad connectivity should be a feature, right, and not a bug. But in these hostile narratives, the connectivity is reframed as evidence of hidden networks or extremist infiltration. So I want to just talk briefly about the political impact. So some of the organizations, actually one of the organizations we identified as a generator of manipulated information, the Middle East Forum, has an active lobbying presence on Capitol Hill. And through that lobbying presence on Capitol Hill, it introduced these narratives into Congress in the 115th to 118th US Congress sessions. And in doing so, they triggered congressional hearings, congressional letters to federal agencies, and congressional resolutions. For example, That example I just presented to you about the connection between HHRD and Lashkar-e-Taiba spurred a series of congressional actions. These included a House resolution, 3 formal congressional letters, one to President Biden, one to then Attorney General Merrick Garland, one to the State Department's Coordinator of Counterterrorism, various email exchanges between the House Foreign Affairs Committee staff and USAID's Bureau for Legislative and Public Affairs, and a letter from USAID a letter to USAID's then Administrator Samantha Power from the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So that demonstrably false connection created all this like legislative activity that was a complete and total waste of time. Really had no public good outcome, right? But what the outcome did have was actually like quite negative, right? Because by sort of recycling these claims, legislators perpetuate the swirl of disinformation. They add to it because these congressional letters, these House resolutions, these various correspondences enter the public record where they remain in perpetuity, right? And I'm sure the generators are well aware of that. This is part of the strategy, right? We take this to Congress, we have someone write a letter, that's adding to the swirl of disinformation. That's, adding to our success in smearing whatever the target organization is. So just wanted to say something about the sort of consequences, right? I just mentioned congressional investigations. This swirling disinformation also creates pressure on private philanthropy and government agencies to revoke, withdraw funding, or to question their partnerships with humanitarian organizations. Bank account closures or denials of financial access are something that happens across the humanitarian sector. These particular genre of campaigns targeting US Muslim-led humanitarian organizations have led to, bank account closures as a result of banks trying to minimize and manage their risk. And then I'll say again that these bank account closures, when they're reported on, are taken by the generators and reported by the generators as further evidence of malfeasance, right? This organization had their bank accounts closed, that must mean they're a bad organization. So it like just continues the sort of cycle of disinformation. Obviously, this creates damage to the domestic and international reputation of the targeted charities. Risks to humanitarian operations in the field, including security risks to staff that are carrying out operations in the field. And managing these consequences diverts enormous resources away from the field of humanitarian work, often to things such as crisis communication, risk management, etc., etc. So, this is a democratic problem. Why is this a democratic problem? Well, disinformation shrinks civic space. It undermines religious freedom by curtailing the legitimate activities of important institutions that are central to not only to the flourishing of Muslim communal life, but also to sort of our broader kind of civic space and religious pluralism. It skews policymaking by privileging fear over evidence. And it normalizes the unequal scrutiny of Muslim civil society organizations. So I think we'll probably get to this in the discussion, but I'll just run through the kinds of policy recommendations are in the report. And again, if you want a sort of fuller accounting of what I'm talking about today, I believe the report is available online. But some sort of central policy recommendations for governments, funders, and regulators. Implementation of due diligence and due process safeguards to avoid disrupting legitimate humanitarian work. In other words, sort of giving civil society organizations the same kind of due process rights that we would give individuals in a legal system. That is the ability to kind of refute and dispute allegations that are made, the ability to see the content of the allegations, and a kind of low-cost process to push back against them, right? There's a serious need to prioritize evidence-based assessments over ideological claims, right? So when these kind of fairly thinly veiled, politically driven accusations are made, there needs to be demands of evidence. Serious accusations demand serious evidence, right? Governments need to ensure fair and consistent regulatory standards. How are we defining the kind of risk categories that we are employing in regulation? And I think we may touch upon that a little later. And also investment in tools to detect and report on disinformation. And then for INGOs, unfortunately, diverting resources, more proactive risk assessment and management, investing in crisis communications capacity. Of course, INGOs are already doing that. Consolidating cross-sector alliances. Those cross-sector alliances exist already, but they need to be, leveraged probably in more efficient ways. Being on top of documenting attacks, responding systematically, and engaging human rights frameworks in advocacy. And so I'll close with a few takeaways. Attacks on Muslim-led organizations are a transnational human rights issue. Although I've focused here on the US context, this disinformation doesn't know borders. It travels very quickly across borders. I see oftentimes the work of the organizations I mentioned earlier, such as the Middle East Forum in particular, appearing in various publications across Europe. And I see, the US-based organizations picking up narratives that are produced elsewhere. So, this is an international problem. These campaigns are coordinated, resourced, and long-running, and the result is real harm. Distorted humanitarian work and a shrinking civic space. Organizations whose central focus is providing aid to vulnerable populations and saving lives are forced to defend themselves against disinformation instead. And Muslim-led humanitarian INGOs are on the front lines of this pressure, facing reputational damage, stalled partnerships, and operational barriers that ultimately hurt the communities they serve. So the call to action, I guess, is the policy must be driven by evidence and transparency, not fear, not bias, not disinformation. We need funders, governments, media, civil society leaders to reject unverified claims, demand credible evidence, and protect the organizations that are executing a unique mandate to carry out essential humanitarian work. And because the cost of not doing these things will be paid by the most vulnerable in society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gerald. You may have a seat.
May I sit down?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. FitzGerald, for diligently showcasing the vital elements of the research findings. I'm more than certain that all of us are left entitled and with more knowledge than before. Now we will transition into a panel where it is my pleasure to be welcoming Wasim Ahmed, former CEO of Islamic Relief Worldwide, with over 25 years of experience in humanitarian and development work. And prior to leading IRW, he held senior roles, including at Oxfam, as well as Islamic Relief Worldwide's Director of International Programs. And now currently he's serving as the Executive Director of External Relations at Islamic Relief Sweden, continuing to shaping the global partnerships and strategic engagement across the sector. So please welcome Mr. Ahmed to the stage. Thanks so much. Okay. Perfect. First and foremost, may I ask how you're feeling about this so far, Mr. Ahmed? How's your feelings?
Yeah, I think it's something I must say that what my colleague professor was sharing his report, and I was looking back my work for the last 25 years, and I was resonating a lot of things. And one thing I must say that there must be a research, and we did something within Islamic Relief. How much does it cost us as Islamic or Muslim organization to send money across in countries where we work, like Syria, Palestine, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Afghanistan? It costs us actually double the amount that other organizations they send money across. Why? Because banks, when they do their due diligence, when they look at Islamic, then straight away they start asking questions. It gets delayed. Fund transfer, we have to use expensive providers to send money across. And also, we must not forget that we are here to save lives. We are here to serve our rights holders. Every moment that is delaying us by delivering food, healthcare is going to cost lives. And we cannot put value to loss of lives. And this is, when I was going through, when Professor was taking us through the takeaways, and I was saying that this is something that we need to look at it and bring to the policy level how much your fake news or disinformation is costing in terms of people's lives all around the world.
Perfect, Mr. Ahmed. And then in terms of, given your experience, vast extensive experience within Islamic Relief and the humanitarian sector overall, could you please explain and elaborate to the audience Islamic Relief's mission and how Islamic Relief operate on a global level to deliver humanitarian aid and development assistance?
Thanks, Akram. Islamic Relief started in 1984 with a mission to alleviate poverty all across the world. And how this organization was started, in the United Kingdom, in 1984, there was a famine in Sudan, and young medical doctors coming primarily from Islamic world, international students, they teamed together to go out and help them and provide assistance with food aid, healthcare to children who were dying of starvation. The organization started right from there, that one student hall or room where the student came together. And since then, 41 years, Islamic Relief has been operating more than 30 countries and providing services to millions of people every year. I'm not up to date with the numbers. I'm the former CEO now, IRW, but it was 17 million people in 2024 that we reach all across the world. And with 300 million pound program spent to reach out to those people in hard to reach countries where we operate. One of the things Islamic Relief started doing is rights-based approach. Islamic Relief believes in bringing dignity back. We treat people who we serve not as beneficiaries, but as a rights holder, and involved in delivering humanitarian aid and assistance, not only just delivering, but even planning as well when we go in a crisis countries. Islamic Relief since then has really championed in providing healthcare, education. Gender-based violence is one of the things that we bring in our Islamic perspective, how important it is to bring to light some of the issues that happen during crisis situations, especially when it's man-made crisis with the conflict, and also natural crisis as well. So these are some of the areas Islamic has been helping and providing assistance. But I must say that in my term as a CEO, as the global CEO of the organization, we were coming across bottlenecks delivering aid, not because that we don't have money, but because the regulators, they are trying to give us punitive actions because of this disinformation. So when we are traveling, we were stopped. When we are sending money, we were stopped. And even coming here in Sweden, in one of, because I'm not EU now, I'm British, but non-EU, I was asked by one of the immigration officer, you are going where? I've said, I'm going to this event now, I'm traveling. Okay, you are Islamic organization. What Islamic got to do with charity work? So that was a question even last night I have to answer. So that shows that where we stand as a society or as a civil society, we are here celebrating Human Rights Day. But this gives us a lot of reflection. And I was sharing with my colleague over lunch break that this question I have to answer, and I thought to share with all of you.
No, perfect for shedding light on the background, but also giving the professor gave us the analytical and the theoretical background. Could you please shed some light on how this reality of disinformation has affected Muslim civil society organizations from things and aspects such as funding and staff safety. Could you please elaborate to the audience on that reality?
I think it's a huge impact. One thing I must say that if we look at for last 10 years, there's a bit of a research we did, the number of organizations with Islamic faith, they're going out and doing charitable work are going down, decreasing because of restrictions they have to face. A lot of organizations, their administration costs have gone up across Europe, at least in 3 countries who I have interacted with, Germany, United Kingdom, and France, where they are spending way more having systems, financial systems, so that they manage to get the money from A to B, and also to satisfy their regulators. It's all right. We need to respect regulations. We have to ensure banking scrutiny, but it must be across the board. As Professor said, that it has to be transparent and accountable process. It's not that you ask questions from one organization but don't ask from another organization. It must be across the board same. So a lot of organizations are going down. The civic space is shrinking. Funding is going down absolutely. When we look at proportionality, if there is any misinformation, what we see is straight away funding cuts. This is disproportionate. You can't just based on this misinformation, you cut the funding and let the organization starve. I know at least 3 organizations, I don't want to mention the name here, they are sitting on hundreds and thousands of dollars, but they can't send the money abroad to help for the causes they raise money for, because they are not allowed by the banks and the regulators. We talk about staff security and safety. Absolutely. This is, I must say, is a huge finding. I have experienced myself staff in Islamic Relief 3 different operation countries where they were harassed, attacked. Also, they were denied banking services in the country. Why? Because they said this, your organization you work for is on the Google. And by association, as an employee, we cannot offer you personal banking services. And that shows a lot to me, where staff will not be willing to apply for, or applicants to organization representing Islamic faith. Third, I would say erosion of trust. I think this is a massive thing, which we have seen that erodes, but also it leaves scars. I'll put it that way. Regardless of if you get the justice system saying this, no, you are not, you are a clean guy. But the scar will remain for a long time. And people associate you who are not really following whether what the justice system said, they will still tag you an organization who was branded terrorist. And this is not helping when it comes to the civic space or growing of these organizations.
No, indeed, that's a harsh reality. And just to shed some reflection on that, most of Muslim NGOs are vetted, with external screenings and usually get fair assessment. But it makes life much harder when you have the disinformation sort of taking over the discourse, as opposed to the evaluations which are objective. And so, with that being said, I would like to transition to Dr. FitzGerald in regards to the reality that you highlighted diligently in terms of. And not just from across the Atlantic, but it's a global phenomenon that we see here in Europe as well. The disinformation is heavily influencing the discourse. What are some tangible changes needed in the relationship between civil society actors, but also states, governments, to ensure that we have a fair and lawful, proportionate procedures when it comes to ensuring that we can mitigate false accusations, because they're there, right? So we need to, how do we navigate within this?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned earlier, the shifting the kind of paradigm to think of civil society organizations as individuals in terms of due process, right? So I think there needs to be really robust due process safeguards for civil society organizations, and that means that when allegations are made, and they make their way into government agencies or the political process, that they need to be I mean, first of all, they should just be scrutinized by the political actors or policy actors involved. And they probably shouldn't go any further, certainly in the ones that I've examined, shouldn't go any further. But, you know, if allegations if action is being taken on allegations, those allegations should be sort of presented to the target organization and said, you know, these allegations have been made. This is the evidence that we have. And then there should be a process, a low-cost process for the targeted organizations to dispute or refute the allegations. And, you know, there should be a kind of level of proportionality involved in that in terms of, you know, what are the risk categories that government funding agencies, for example, might be operating with? How are they defining those risk categories? What do they mean by things like values or extremism or et cetera, right? Because there's often a lot of ambiguity there, and that allows for kind of politically motivated or ideologically motivated allegations to kind of go much further in policy process than they should ever go. So sort of clarity around terms and clarity around risk categories, I think, is also important.
Well, thank you, Dr. FitzGerald. And just quickly on that, Mr. Ahmed, since based on your experience from the European context, we've had conversations in terms of your relationship and experience engaging with members of parliament in the UK. Could you perhaps give us some perspective on what tangible changes are needed to ensure that Muslim organizations are sort of ensured safety from disinformation?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I always say that civil society in general, not just Islamic faith or Muslim organization, treat us as partner, not suspect. Because increasingly we have seen that there is a thing that if you're coming from Islamic faith, you are suspected straight away before we engage you. So I think it's important to have the trust building from the government that you are a partner, we want to engage with you in terms of policy dialogue, in terms of international development, civic space, and really demonstrating democratic and transparent values of a society, of a country, by involving, engaging in the dialogue. And in my experience, I have seen it depends who is in the position when it comes to the government, whether they are willing to spend time with you, to have a cup of coffee with you and have a dialogue. I think it's really important to have a dialogue to build trust before we move forward. Second thing, as Professor Gerald said, I think I think no one is denying this. We as a civil society organization, if there is any wrongdoing happening, must be scrutinized, investigated, and whatever according to law, the punishment or the fine, but it must be a transparent, open process by an independent process, not just like, oh, it's a national security or we can't do that. It has to be transparent and must be held accountable, the governments or the organization or the departments who are going to put unfair restrictions. Third, but most important, I think is very important to uphold the ethical standards of journalism or sensible social media operator, because now we're operating in an age where anybody posts anything on social media. But are we really going to be guided by social media? Because some of the government, in my experience, they say, the classic example Professor gave about Bangladesh, and I happened to be there when we are communicating and coordinating the response to the Rohingya crisis in Bangladesh. And absolutely, that was not the intention from Bangladeshi government at all. And that transpired later on, where we were given the lead role among other organizations to help Rohingya refugees. And that gives me this thing that when you throw something in social media, it sticks. And we must lead the way as civil society organization to say that as a responsible social media operator or regulator, you must look at credible information behind it, not the disinformation.
Yeah, and that's interesting because for us operating in the humanitarian sector, we're abiding by accountability and transparency. transparency, and which should be reflected across the sector. So I think that's a very important point you made. But now, if I may ask Dr. FitzGerald, two questions involved. So I think maybe this question is rather, we have something in mind, but what are the long-term risks that you foresee with the continuation of disinformation influencing the discourse towards civil society actors? And also, besides yourself, of course, how can researchers and journalists help mitigate this worldview? And I'll have Mr. Ahmed as well answer afterwards. So,
long-term risks, well, I mean, I think one of the long-term risks is that if we don't kind of afford the types of protections that we've been talking about to Muslim organizations, you know, it shrinks civic space, it erodes public trust, but it also kind of creates a precedent or a normalization of sort of opaque processes whereby, you know, there will be other groups who then become targeted, right? So we're, you know, I think we're sort of seeing this in certain places now, where a variety of other groups are likely to be targeted in much the same way, right? Any group that you don't ideologically align with the sort of government of the day, such as LGBT groups, various groups in the political left, etc. I'm speaking about under the Trump administration, second Trump administration, you know, are likely to become targeted. So, I mean, I think that goes back to the need to kind of institutionalize sort of processes. I mean, I think the political context in the US right now is such that, you know, that's not likely to happen in the short term. But in terms of other kind of long-term effects, you know, it just damages religious pluralism, right? It builds barriers between, or it contributes to building barriers between different faith traditions. You know, creates distrust between faith traditions and sort of secular organizations as well. And you know, this is just leads to kind of bad outcomes in the humanitarian space and civil society space.
And what role can journalists and researchers have in terms of mitigating this? I know that maybe some journalists might feel that, oh, this is a sensitive area to investigate, but what role do they have in your view? Academia.
Well, certainly in the US, like journalists are, you know, to a large extent self-regulated, right? But, you know, we would hope that journalists kind of apply, you know, strong evidentiary standards to their work and ethical standards and journalistic ethics. Unfortunately, in the sort of current ever-evolving media landscape, that's a situation that's, I think, getting worse rather than getting better. You know, researchers can, you know, it's become really quite difficult, if I'm to be quite frank about it, to conduct research on disinformation and manipulated information in the US. In fact, the entire term manipulated information, I kind of switched between the two terms because I was advised to use the term manipulated information because there was some bills going through the Congress in the US sort of saying, raising the specter of charging anybody who designated a individual U.S. citizen as a creator of disinformation could be, in fact, charged. Now that legislation didn't go anywhere in Congress, but I was advised to don't use the word disinformation, use manipulated information. But as I was coming back here, I was like, I can probably use disinformation here. It's all right. So so that's why my presentation probably slipped between the two terms. I've gone off on a little bit of a tangent there, but yeah, I mean, journalists basically need to kind of uphold ethics and uphold quality of good journalism, and you know, really, you know, hold on to the basic idea that serious allegations require serious evidence.
No, perfect. And Mr. Ahmed, since you excellently highlighted some of the future risks, I would like to ask you first, Mr. Ahmed, and then also Professor FitzGerald for a closing remarking on this question before we open up to the audience. So looking ahead, which specific political or legal reforms, in your view, your opinion, would most strengthen the democratic civic space for Muslim NGOs, but also civic society in general overall?
I think we are operating in an environment where Professor mentioned about pluralism, and obviously it's diminishing. I wouldn't say that it has gone, but it's diminishing in societies. And I think a legal framework is required to protect this. And when we talk about diminishing pluralism, it means threat to freedom, democracy, your space where you can operate as an individual, as an organization. So it's under threat across the globe. And I think this is absolutely needs to be discussed where regulatory frameworks are needed, but also I believe it requires independent scrutinization of some of these claims, because that's the demand not only from Muslim organization, but a civil society organization. And we have seen, I'll slightly go back, as Professor said, about trust. I think the trust is the main thing when you talk about, when you throw something at somebody, and it means you are taking them away from the society, from politician, from the generations. And when we heard word globalization, when I was in university, that globalization. So what globalization means, and some of these organizations we have seen in the West, in America, diaspora communities, when they immigrated and they settled there, they were representing kind of where they're coming from, the part of the world. And they are the best place to really demonstrate what's happening in those countries and what are the solutions. And when we talk about democracy, we need to give them the space that they can really reflect and can come up with solutions and help going back to their roots. But it's going away. Some of these organizations who've been deprived of, and I think it needs to be protected at political level, but through a legal framework as well.
And Professor FitzGerald, do you have a closing remark on a specific legal reform, things of that nature?
No, I mean, I just go back on, at risk of repeating myself, to institutionalizing, as a legal matter, a process that can kind of assess claims that are made and kind of interrogate them, a process that involves providing evidence to organizations that claims are made against, a process for them to dispute and refute on a fairly low-cost basis those claims. So I think that's something that can be institutionalized and should be institutionalized. I mean, I know in Sweden you're famous for the kind of ombudsman concept. So something like along those lines that deals with these kind of claims against civil society organizations in order to kind of protect and sort of expand civic space that is indeed, I think, shrinking. Yeah.
Perfect. Great remarks. I think we have maybe room for 2 questions from the audience. So if there's anyone that has a reflection or a question, you may stand up, and then we could. Oh yeah, there's microphones to be delivered as well. So if anyone has a question or remark, raise your hand, and perfect over there to the left.
No, thank you for a really great presentation. I just wanted to touch upon the recommendation that you provided, because most of these recommendations were mainly to government institutions. But what about the Muslim organization going through this misinformation? Is there anything that you think could be done from their side in order to push back?
For me? I think oftentimes it's the organizations in terms of, and Wasim can speak much better to this than I can, but my sense would be that the organizations that I've interfaced with in the US are often very hesitant to push back, because they feel by pushing back on these claims themselves, they're actually then contributing to the swirl. And I've seen this actually happen, where the example I presented about HHRD and being connected to Lashkar-e-Taiba, which of course is totally false, they pushed back against this. They issued a press release sort of completely deconstructing the claim or attempting to deconstruct the claim. And the particular organization that had made the claim took their press release and they wrote a whole piece saying HHRD have released this secret memo. They called it like a secret memo and made it all like shadowy and stuff. And then which our investigators have revealed here. And then they reprinted the press release. And so like even pushing back against it kind of ends up contributing to the swirl. So it's very difficult, actually. It's very difficult. And again, I mean, there's lots of evidence out there to back up the idea that these sort of bad impressions are much easier to create than they are to refute. So, there is evidence as well that sort of pre-bunking disinformation can be effective, and debunking. So, there is some contradictory evidence on the desirability of pre-bunking and debunking disinformation. But overall, I'd just say, like, it's really very difficult to kind of push back, I think, for the organizations themselves to push back against this disinformation.
Can I come?
Yeah, please.
I think it's a really good question. As my colleague Gerard said, organizations, and we must not forget that civil society organizations, they operate on charity, on donations. And sometimes lawsuit costs hundreds and thousands of dollars and millions in some cases. And second thing is, what we see in in my experience, at the small scale level organization, they say it's not worth the fight because it's not a transparent process. But what we have started doing, Islamic Relief globally, that sporting organization, whoever, and I don't want to mention names, but we've been approached for the last 4 or 5 years, even secular organization with no faith-driven motive, either Christianity or Muslim or Jewish, but they approached us because how we actually push back. And I would like to share with you a very recent thing that came out in one of the news channel in United Kingdom, GB News. They gave their platform, live platform, to a hate speaker talking about Islamic Relief, they're a terrorist organization, and they're doing this across the world. They've been listed here and there, all this information. And we contacted that TV channel that this is wrong, you gave a platform. And then we sent a legal notice, and the case went into court. And after 8 months, last week, they apologized in a live transmission that GB News gave a platform, which was a fake news, and we apologize. And they paid damages, the legal fee back to Islamic Relief. That shows that when you believe in what you're doing, you can defend your space. But it's not always a decision because of the circumstances of the organization. But also, in countries where you're operating, if you have less or no trust in the judiciary system or the framework, then you decide not to go for it. And we know many countries in the world where the judiciary system is not at the level where even you spend the money, nothing will come out from it. So it is primarily choice down to the organization. But Islamic Relief, and I know 3 other organizations globally, they've been working on it, supporting and sharing information and experiences. So I hope I answered your question to some extent.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ahmed and Professor FitzGerald. Unfortunately, we have been signaled that we're out of time. So with that being said, I would like to thank everyone for attending, and also, first and foremost, thank Dr. FitzGerald for taking the time to come here and shedding nuanced perspectives on this phenomenon, and also Mr. Ahmed for your perspectives and reflections as well. And thank you to the audience. So if we can give a round of applause to our guest and conclude this remark. Thank you.
Thank you.